Hey, everybody, welcome back. We are so excited to have you here listening in, and we're really excited that we have a super special guest that has joined us today, Mr. Steve Rogers.
Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's
Yeah,
great to be here.
awesome, awesome. And then, of course, Laurie is
Hey.
on too. So again, we're going to really dive into an awesome story and testimony, and we're really again just letting God lead this. So, Steve, if you want to just kind of share briefly, like where your story begins with God, like the beginning of your faith, and just we'll go from there.
Well, I've always had a faith. I've always been a churchgoer, always striving to try to understand what God meant in my life and what God meant for me. And the thing about it was, I think, and probably till I was in my late 30s, and I'm 62 now. So in my late 30s, I kind of felt like I wasn't getting any traction, if that's the right way to say it. I didn't feel like I was understanding what it was all about. Now, that could have just been because I had a career and three kids and a wife, and I was just running around like crazy, but I never really felt like I was getting any traction. And then, uh, I guess, long story short, I ended up having lunch with a man who, as a spiritual mentor, and we started talking about his journey and my journey. And at the end of the lunch, he recommended that I go get William Barclay. He's a English pastor from the 1950s, and he did studies of the entire First Testament. And he said, go get his study of the Gospel of Mark and start reading that. And I did it. I got it on the way home. And from that point forward, all of a sudden, things started to change. And I spent probably 3 years reading that entire study of the Gospel of Mark. Excuse me, of the New Testament by William Barclay. And that changed everything. All of a sudden, I started seeing things happening and thinking differently. And there were these strange little coincidences in my life that were moving me forward. And that was really the first step of the journey. Now, there's a lot that's happened between then and now, but it was that in almost daily involvement in God's word that really jump started the process. And I'm also very fortunate. Whenever I use the word we, I'm referring to me and my wife. I'm very fortunate that our journeys have been very parallel. Um, and so we've been blessed to be able to walk that together, which isn't true for every couple. And we've been blessed to walk that together and kind of, I'm a former business guy, so come up the curve at the same rate. So that was really the instigating moment, was that lunch and starting to read the New Testament by William Barclay.
Wow, that's
I
awesome.
love that you bring that up, that your wife and you had parallel purpose, because that's actually something God has been showing me for the last 14 years. Talking about marriage covenant and how marriage covenant is part of your purpose. So therefore, of course, if you're meant to be married and your stuff will be parallel because you're walking the same purpose path. So I love that you brought that up because that just kind of matches what he's been sharing with me of what a marriage covenant actually is. And I just kind of went off track there for a little bit, but I'll bring it back. I just had to share because I love, like you said, the little synchronicities of the fact that you brought that up. And that's something I've been talking about a lot. So thanks for sharing that.
It's interesting because there's a point in life where you have to figure out what the number one priority is. I mean, there's God, right? And I'm not talking about the umbrella of God and Jesus and faith. That's obviously the number one priority. And when you have a young family, there's a process there. What is the tiebreaker, no matter what? And I decided sometime in my late 30s that maybe even before that, that the tiebreaker was always going to be my marriage. So, I mean, there's times when someone's sick or whatever where you have to prioritize things. But if the decision was a business dinner or being home with my wife and family, if I didn't have to be at the dinner, I'd go home. And so I used that as the tiebreaker. And I think that made a difference for me in that I now had that priority as the number one thing.
Mhm.
Before you have children, it's not hard to make that priority. Once you have children, it's just chaos. I mean, it really is. The most organized house in the world is chaos after you have kids. And ours would not fall into the most qualified house in the world category. So, but that was, and so I've really tried to honor that. Now I've messed up a million times to the husband, but I've learned from it and fixed things as I go, but I have messed up. Nothing huge, but I've messed up.
Mhm. I love that you brought that up too, because yeah, in marriage you're one, two become one. That makes it a primary relationship. Something else I talked about. There's primary and secondaries. Your business was secondary relationship. Your wife is a
Right.
primary because you're courted with God. So that's a primary relationship. Even though God is still above the marriage, your wife is still primary. And
Right.
that's so key that you said that too. I love that you brought that up too. Um,
Thank you.
so let's go back to your story then, since I kind of went off track there a little bit. But like, what are some of the most impactful moments where you really saw God in your life?
Mhm.
Could you share some of those?
Yeah, and I think there's one. I wouldn't say it's minor, but it's not one of those ones you'd put in a book or something. But it was the I ended up working at a company for 20 years, and through that, I met an awful lot of people that were connected with Jesus and with God. And it was a publicly traded company, so no one was walking around the hallway saying, "Hey, go Jesus." But you get to know people and you talk to them and you learn. And the fascinating thing was I had interviewed for the job I started with at that company, and there was a really like a 6 month radio silence that the gears of whatever were grinding away. And I closed the door to my office where I was prior to that job, and I just said a simple prayer. I said, God, if it's your will, could you just let me know one way, or let me know what your will is one way or another in relation to this job? 'Cause, I mean, I really wanted the job. And I got up and I opened the door and the phone rang, and it was the job offer. Um, I can't put that into a coincidence category. I mean, I know there are people who will, but I can't. And that plus the William Barclay stuff is really what brought me along. And then there was a very, very profound experience. As I was moving through this process, this journey, there was still every once in a while I would have that, is there really someone up there? If you try to intellectualize what God is, you're never going to get there. It's nonsensical, right? You're either in or you're out on whether or not God is there. And what happened was when my oldest daughter was a senior in high school, she was at a field trip about 60 miles away from here, and her and this kid were goofing around, and he dropped her, and her head hit a curb, and she went into this seizure. And it turned out that they had to put her in a helicopter and bring her to the big hospital here in town in Richmond. And she was in the intensive care unit with blood on the brain. So they said she'd probably be okay, but it seemed pretty darn serious to me. And so she was in the neurological intensive care unit. So what happened was my wife and I were there, obviously. Someone took the two younger kids. And around 7 o'clock at night in the ICU, Kathy went home to look at the other kids and make sure everything was going okay there. They throw you out of the ICU during the shift change, at least in this hospital. And one of my closest friends, who's also a very strong faith friend, is someone I share my faith with a lot, came down and we're sitting there in the cafeteria in this hospital. And we're eating our Chick-fil-A in the cafeteria. And while we're sitting there, this man walks up to us. And he was African American with a scruffy beard and wearing like kind of like a green janitorial kind of uniform. At least that's the way it registered with me. And he just walked up to me out of nowhere and he says, "Let me ask you a question." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Is God good?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Good." And he walked away. And me and my friend just kind of looked at each other like, "What the heck was that?" And then he walked back maybe 30 seconds later and he said, "You have a child in here with blood on the brain. And I said, yeah. He said, God is good. And I'm paraphrasing here. This isn't exact quotes, but this is what happened. And he said, um, God wants you to read Psalm 91 every day until she leaves the hospital. So now he's told me that I have a child. Now he's told me that it's a girl. And now he's told me to read this scripture. He said, the Bible is good. And then as he walked away, he turned back to me and he said, remember, she's God's child. And you know how when you hear a sentence, sometimes you anticipate the end of the sentence? I thought he was going to say she's God's child too, but he didn't. He said she's God's child, which to me are two very distinctly different sentences. And then he kind of vanished into the crowd. It was like watching the Field of Dreams where they go into the corn husks out in left field or whatever. And so me and my friend looked at each other, and he had a Bible with him in his backpack, and he pulled it out, and we read Psalm 91, which is a beautiful psalm of protection. And of course, I way overachieved. I read it every night for a year. And I memorized it, and I still use it 3 or 4 times a week as a prayer. And Psalm 91, verse 11, he will command his angels to concern you and guard you in all your ways, is kind of my go-to verse that I use when something's not right or I'm feeling, whatever. But what happened in those few moments in that hospital was that doubt about the guy up in the sky, so to speak, completely disappeared. I, at that point, was all in. You're either in or out. And that changed everything from that point on, because there was never that intellectual distraction anymore about God and about the straight existence of God. And that really, really made a difference. And it brought me so much in my journey. And this all kind of coalesced with some very stressful times in our life where we were going through an awful lot there's too much to list, but everybody has those seasons. And it was about a 3-4 year season with death and surgeries and alcoholics and everything else. And I realized at the end of it how much God had walked with us. And those two things coalesced. And of course, at the hospital, I went back the next day looking for the guy. Of course, I trotted downstairs. I couldn't find him. But and the fact that Psalm 91:11 resonates with me, I mean, I guess I can say this to you too when you won't think I'm crazy. I think he was some kind of angel that came down. I don't know. And it probably doesn't even matter, right? I mean, that he just did what he did, but he just vanished. And it was I'm getting chills talking about it here, but that was the biggest moment in my life, faith-wise. And things have moved since then. I hope I didn't talk too much, but that was
my
was
That's
the journey.
amazing.
I'm like feeling the whole time you're talking from my head to my toe, like just chills, my hair's standing up. And I had that thought too, that was an angel, for sure.
And the fact that it was that friend that was with me is just amazing, because he's the one that I would share the most with about faith, and that he trucked down there just to be with me, right? So I wasn't sitting there in the ICU alone. And so there's no coincidences in life. So that was not a coincidence.
Absolutely not. Yeah, that's incredible. Wow. And I agree with you too. And what I think too is the heart. The Lord knew your heart posture, right? He knew you had doubts, but He's the one that sees through our hearts. And when you think of some people that, in your instance, we have these miraculous, wondrous experiences, that it's like, what? Like, how did that happen to you, right? And then there's some people that have so much doubt, but their heart posture isn't in a place to receive a miracle like that, a miracle moment. And so He knew that would be it for you. He knew, this is all I have to do to get him to commit to me and to know me, to trust me.
And I forgot to mention one thing. That Monday, this happened on a Friday or a Thursday. That Monday I had prayed, could you make these doubts go away? Now, I do not think that God dropped my daughter on her head to teach me that lesson, but I think it was a byproduct of the experience. I don't think He said, well, hey, go drop his daughter on her head and let's get on with this. But so there was that, I guess that confirms your heart comment, right? I was heart ready,
Yeah,
So it was obviously a very impactful experience.
for sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, we know that you wrote a book.
Mhm.
When did that fall into this timeline of like your,
Yeah.
what was that scenario about? What brought that on?
Well, what happened was, okay, so the head thing was probably the head thing. That's a terrible way to put it. The experience in the hospital, that's terrible. I'm sorry to my daughter. The experience in the hospital, I think, was like 2010-ish.
Okay.
But in 2016, I retired from my corporate job at 55. And I did it for the sole purpose of trying to become a writer, because that's always been a dream of mine. And I started by trying to become Stephen King. So I was killing people, strangling people, all kinds of stuff. Kind of fun to write, but um, not a great avenue. Plus the slot's taken, right? There's already a Stephen King. So in 2017, we were taking a trip to Israel, my wife and I. And just as a little background, we have been surrounded. Neither one of us has any issue with drugs or alcohol, my wife and I, but we have been surrounded by alcoholics and drug addicts, immediate extended family. I want to protect those folks and not get into details, but it's caused a lot of struggle and pain. And so we're flying over to Israel. And at this point, I had already written one novel and a bunch of short stories, none of which were published. They were all, I was trying to learn the process. And I had this weird thought at 40,000 feet. And I said, I wonder if I was an alcoholic who had just been sprung from rehab and I had to take this trip. And I have no idea why that occurred to me. So I ended up creating a character and journaling in his voice while we were traveling. And when I got back, I explained to my wife what I was doing because she didn't ask me on the trip because I'm always journaling. That's what writers do. And I told her, and she said, you might have a book there. And I said, well, that's not my genre. And in her nice way, she said, you're not published. You don't have a genre yet. And I said, good point. And so I researched, is there such a thing as Christian fiction? And there is. There's a whole world of Christian fiction out there. So I ended up writing the novel, writing the story, and I took this alcoholic. I went through my trip with him, brought him to the first step in redemption and stepping towards health. And long story short, I was fortunate enough, I found a publisher and it got published. But that's not really the story. The real story is I was preparing to speak about the book one day, and it dawned on me that I had let go of all the anger and resentment and fear and projection and whatever negative emotion you want to say was in my heart around these other folks in my life when I finished the first draft of the book, which really means it's nothing but a big fat journal entry. And when I released that, my journey changed almost as significantly as the experience in the hospital because I cleaned that garbage out of my heart. And then about 4 months later, I realized, because once I figured that out, I started praying about it and journal about it and talking to friends about it. I forgave myself somewhere in there too for having all those feelings because you don't want to have those feelings towards someone you love. And you're also hindering their recovery because they know you have those feelings. And so that forgiveness step was the next major thing. I should say, I haven't had a third one yet. It was the second. I don't want to have a third one. That's enough. Two's good. But was another major step. And since then, things have really changed in that I've stopped, like for instance, I still am a writer, but I've stopped setting goals about my writing. Instead, I said, I'm going to try to write in conformity with God's will for my life. And then let all the other chips fall where they're going to fall. I'm going to stop worrying. Like my wife will tell you that she's never met a human being more at war with his spiritual gifts than me, because I'm really good at like administrative and leadership stuff, which means every time I get on something, I'm like the chair and I hate it. But it's a gift and I need to embrace that. And so I've embraced that now. It's just making sense. That's what I've opened and now wherever God takes me, God takes me. And, I wish I'd figured it out before I was, 60, 61 years old or whenever this happened. but maybe as you said earlier, maybe my heart wasn't ready. Taylor, you said that earlier. At that point, maybe my heart wasn't ready for that. So that's the whole writing thing. And so if it had never been published, if the book had just been sitting on this shelf over here, like my first novel is, it still would have changed my life. And that's a good thing. And so that's how all that happened, though. I think God obviously was part of that.
That is how you know it's God, because when he speaks
Yeah.
through us, it's not just
Well,
healing the people we're talking to, it's healing us on its way through.
yeah. The rest of it's byproduct, or ancillary benefits. And I also figured out, interestingly, that when I was strangling people and all that in the first round of books and short stories, I was still working out the same anger. I just wasn't working it out effectively.
Right.
And so that I don't know, maybe that had to be part of the process, but I probably could have skipped that year and started writing Christian fiction right away and maybe sped this thing up a little bit.
No.
So anyways, yeah, that was
I think it did
that's the writing part of the journey.
I think it did align with your heart posture pivot, because what you were writing about was just a manifestation of what was inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened when you wrote that Christian fiction book is, like you said, you had your own heart surgery, and it was in this fiction novel that you were able to do so. But, it was about an alcoholic that was, being redeemed. But really, like you said, it was fixing your own heart around anger and resentment towards that specific thing, that specific area in your life of other people. It wasn't like you were the one that was actually facing that, but God was doing some heart healing through that process. So I think that's so important to recognize for all of us, that what we do, our actions and our words, are just a byproduct of our heart, of the inside. So whatever's festering in here is what is going to be expressed out here. So
No matter how hard you try to hide it, it's going to get through.
yeah.
Well, and I learned too that anger is a byproduct, and I had to figure out what the heck was causing the anger.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I was a powder keg. I mean, a pot of water boiling on the stove just all the time, waiting to spill over the top. And I feel a lot better about it now. Yeah.
So can you actually talk about that for just a couple minutes? The anger, and you said through this
Sure.
book, you found a lot of healing from that. So you found your root, and like, what were like the steps beyond that like you felt like really helped you? And if you've ever faced anything past that where you felt kind of that anger maybe bubble up, like what have you done to subside it?
That's a great question. And what has been the big change, or the big tool, that's a better way for me, has been I'm involved in Al-Anon, the 12-step program. And that has provided, I mean, hundreds of avenues for when I start, for lack of a better term, drifting off course, to bring myself back to center. And I don't always succeed, by the way. I mean, I fail because I'm human. Whether it's friends in the program or readings in the program or even the slogans in the program, I find something that I can fall back on. And so for me, that has been and it's not true for everybody, but for me, that has been a very effective way to not only flush the stuff out, but to maintain the heart being in the right place. I love that phrase, but to maintain the heart being in the right place. And in fact, I was at a meeting right before this. I go to 2 meetings a week, and I have Al-Anon friends I talk to on the phone and all of that. And so that has been, I think that, in addition to the fact that as I cleared all that garbage out, the word speaks to me in a different way. And I'm in the word pretty much every day. I mean, every once in a while is a day that's too busy, but pretty much every day I'm in the word, and it speaks to me in a different way now. And there's never, ever, I'm what you would call an optimistic Bible reader. So let me give you an example. If I read Ecclesiastes, you can read Ecclesiastes and say that guy was having the worst day of his life. Or you can read Ecclesiastes and say there's a message there about the fact that it's all about going to God, and this stuff's important, live your life, but it's not the end all be all. Well, I refuse to accept the fact that there's something in that book that isn't that interpretation. There's no pessimism in the Bible. I'm an optimistic Bible reader. And that improved dramatically once I cleared my heart out. I think that makes sense the way I just said that, but that's the way I approach it. So those two things combined, the Al-Anon program and the way my Bible understanding has changed because my heart was cleaner to accept what God had to say to me. Those two things, I think, have really made a difference.
Yeah, I love that. All that writing before the book was so necessary. I call it dump out. Basically, you were dumping out your emotions by writing it.
Jack too. I'm sorry. It was fun. It really was.
But I also like what you said about anger and the boiling pot of water, because that's so true. Because anger doesn't stand by itself. So to me, it's like, our soul is the water, and that when it's just calm, we're calm. And the
Right.
anger is because somebody turned it on. There's something that's turned on in you that makes it boil, and that anger is coming from something. And so it's so important to figure out what's causing the anger, because anger is, I would say, like a second base emotion. It's coming from something else. And I love that you brought it up, but I also like I'm really good at visuals, and so now I'm seeing this pan of water because it is so true. If we don't figure out what's turning it on, it's just going to keep bubbling.
Just
it's going to keep
sit there.
festering. Yeah. So
if you don't turn the burner off, it's just going to boil forever. Exactly. Well, worse, it's going to boil off and ruin the pan, which in this analogy, I guess would be me, right? Yeah. So that wouldn't be good either.
And burn anyone that comes too close.
Yeah. But I want to add a caveat here to make sure that you and whoever might be watching this understands. I by no means think I have figured this stuff out with God. I mean, I'm so far away from what God's ideal is for what a person should be on this planet that it's so humbling, it's staggering. So I haven't figured this out. I'm just telling you where I am in my journey, because I have a real tough time with like that concept of a mature Christian, because Jesus was a mature Christian, but he was Christ, right? The rest of us, we're just trying to figure it out. And so I still fall all the time and mess up all the time. The difference is now I recognize it sooner, and I have tools to try to get myself back on track. But I wanted to make sure I said that, because I didn't want people to think I've got this figured out, because I don't at all.
Yeah, we're always becoming more of God, or
work
less
in
of
progress,
God.
as my pastor likes to say.
We are. Every step we take is progress or not. It's like, what are our choices choosing to become more like God or less like God? Those are basic. That's how I narrow it down. Either you're becoming more like him or less like him. There's no in between. There's no lukewarm. If you're not striving to become more of who he created you to be, then you're actually striving to be less than, even when you're not making a choice. So
the interesting thing is, because I mean, I'm not old, but I'm older, is at my age, you start thinking about, man, all those years I wasted when I could have been, doing this or doing that. And it tends to hit me a little hard. But that's probably from the bad side of the equation too, right? Regret. So
right, which we don't need to hold on, because God is not regret. So there's what he's really taught me is there's a perfect time and a perfect place, but there's also a perfect us. Like Taylor was saying, our heart has to be where it needs to be for that perfect time and perfect place for it to come into fruition. Because we may come to that perfect time, perfect place multiple times, but we're just not ready yet.
Right. It's true.
Yeah. So powerful. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for sharing with us. Do you have any last words that you'd like to share with our listeners? Anyone that might be facing trial, anyone that might be in that doubt, that place of doubt, and they're just like, God hasn't really spoken to me, like on that level, anything that you'd want to share with them?
Yeah, I think what I would say, or I shouldn't say what I would say, because I'm about to say it. So what I will say is, my concept with God is, and I actually called my book this, Into the Room. You step into the room with God and be patient, and he will work with you. And understand that journey is something he's going to lead you on. And I have never thought of it until you said it this way today, Taylor. When your heart is ready, he will be there. And I have a Bible study, and sometimes we get frustrated about what we do, and we compare ourselves to like Peter. And I'm like, Peter made the book. I mean, you can't get how many people made the book? We just have to do our best. And so I would say be patient and just know he's there and stay and keep trying. And sooner or later, wherever God wants to take you, he will take you. And I firmly believe that. And I wouldn't have said this before those profound events in my life, right? I would have been like, why isn't this happening? What's going on here? So that's what I would say.
Mhm. Yeah. I just want to add to that, to be willing. We have to be willing to go where God is taking us.
Well, that's a good point. You're right. Willing. And it's funny because in the Bible, especially the men always fight until Moses fighting it, Noah fighting it, now the women seem to sign up. Mary, it's like he goes to Mary and says, you're going to have a baby. And she's, okay. And she's outside singing. And I'm like, I would need some explanation. I'm sorry. But you know what I mean? But the men in the Bible are always fighting, but then when they sign up, everything moves along the way it should. So it's a great point.
Wow, that's a great point. I never thought of that.
Yeah, it's true. Women sign up in the Bible.
We're all in. That's great.
Funny.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, Steve. Thanks for being
Thank
our
you.
guest. And I know I'm impacted by this. I know several others will be as well. So we just appreciate having you on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.